very much indeed, and thank you very much also to you for coming along this afternoon for what I hope will be an interesting experience. So, Network Rail, as many of you will know, has embarked on a major national electrification programme which, when it's completed, will result in a cleaner, greener, more efficient, quieter, and also a railway with more capacity, more bigger trains and more seats. The programme, and we see on the bottom slide, on the bottom part of the slide here, the lines which are currently being planned for electrification, and more seem to be being announced every day. The programme covers some of the United Kingdom's most historic railways, including the Leeds to Selby branch up the top here of 1834, and the North Midland line from Derby up towards Chesterfield by the Stevensons of 1840. That's in addition to the Great Western Railway, which we'll talk about this afternoon rather. And ABA has been working as Network Rail's heritage advisors for the past 4 years now, I guess, in what was seen from the outset to be a working partnership between Network Rail, English Heritage and the various local authorities along the route to try and deliver the best possible solution for this very important piece of national infrastructure. Of the various routes on the map here, the most advanced is the Great Western Modernisation, or the Great Western Electrification Programme, or GWEP as it's known to those who are working on it. It's the most advanced. It's due to open in about 2017. It's costing an extraordinary £1.5 billion, and it covers, or it will electrify 223 route miles from Paddington here to Reading, then down to Newbury, up to Oxford, down to Bristol Temple Meads, and then through into Wales to Cardiff, and on now actually to Swansea as well. And on that route, there are 80 listed structures which are directly affected by the electrification works, and a very considerable number of other listed structures associated, if you count such areas as the Swindon Railway Works, an integral part of the historic Great Western Railway. And of those 80 structures directly on the line, some 67 of them, or 85%, will require some form of works and therefore listed building consent in order to prepare them for electrification. And of that total 223 miles, 118 of them are, and equally the vast majority of the listed structures belong to Brunel's Great Western Railway, obviously from Paddington originally to Reading, turning north through the Goring Gap up to Didcot, then turning west to go along the northern flank of the Downs to Swindon, down to Chippenham, across the tail end of the Cotswolds, or through the tail end of the Cotswolds and Box, before picking up the Avon Valley through Bath and down to Bristol. Some of that line, of course, has already been electrified as far as for the Heathrow spur. The stretch up to Maidenhead is being electrified as part of the Crossrail programme, but what we've been dealing with is basically everything from Maidenhead westwards to Bristol Temple Meads and Cardiff. So here is a map of the listed buildings on the route. For those of you whose eyesight is not absolutely fantastic, there is a hard copy of the map in the front here which you can look at afterwards, but it does give you a sense of just what an extraordinary concentration of structures we do have to deal with. And it's worth noting at this stage, it's quite clear, I think, even from this map, that most of those listed structures are concentrated in the western section of the route, and there are two reasons for that. The first of which, as we shall see, that Brunel really concentrated his kind of design efforts on the western section of the route, but also, and equally important, the western section, particularly from Didcot onwards, has been far less altered than the section from Didcot back towards Paddington, which has been quadrupled and had various other works done to it, all of which have to some extent eroded the legacy of Brunel's legacy. The electrification of the Great Western is the largest single Network Rail project for many years, and it has thrown into very sharp focus the tension which exists between the extraordinary historic importance of the UK's rail infrastructure and the need, on the other hand, to keep it up to date at a time of ever-increasing use. Rail travel has doubled in the past 15 years, and that rise is forecast to continue. And the brunt of that increase has and will continue to fall on our existing lines. So High Speed 2 and so forth will make some difference, but most of those extra passengers need to be accommodated on the likes of the Great Western Railway. So this talk today has two purposes. The first of which is to outline the practical measures and the design solutions which we've been, with Network Rail and English Heritage and others, developing or are still developing to adapt as sensitively as possible the Great Western Railway and all those individual listed structures along it for electrification. But I'd like to discuss more generally the approach that we should be taking to the conservation of our historic engineering infrastructure. Because, as we've seen, the Great Western is just at the start. The North Midland and the Leeds to Selby, for example, are lines of arguably equally, some would say, whisper who dare, even greater importance than God's wonderful railway. So, our legacy of historic engineering infrastructure, is self-evidently, or at least for me, as important a part of our national heritage as the architectural legacy. It is, after all, the canals and railways of the 18th and 19th centuries that unleashed the power of the Industrial Revolution, just as the 20th century infrastructure of motorways and electricity has shaped our lives today. And it was conceived on an heroic scale, as shown here on the front cover of J.C. Bourne's magnificent 1846 series of engravings which celebrates the wonderful achievements of the Great Western Railway. And it is right, therefore, that this historic engineering infrastructure is recognised and protected by listing and scheduling. But, put simply, and I suspect actually oversimply, it does seem to me that there is a fundamental difference between buildings on the one hand and machinery and infrastructure on the other, between, as it were, architecture with a capital A and engineering with a capital E. Engineering structures, and I should say that Ambax's is an engineering practice, so this is very much in our kind of lifeblood. Engineering structures are designed primarily to work. What a machine does is of greater importance than how it looks. Beauty is not a prime criterion of design, though, as we shall see again and again on the Great Western, it can often be the result. So, if a machine no longer works, it loses 99% of its purpose and 99% of its significance. So, this afternoon, in addition to the basic question of whether the electrification of the GWR will be a boon or a disaster for Brunel's railway, there is a wider question to bear in mind, and that is, how far is it acceptable to adapt historic infrastructure to allow it to continue to work? Should it, in fact, be judged by a slightly different set of rules than we would apply to more conventional listed buildings? And to help answer these questions, I'd like to start with just a very brief resume of the history of the Great Western Railway and its importance, which will be very well known to many of you in this room, but then go on to a summary of what electrification means in practical terms, both in terms of the kit required to deliver the electricity to the trains, and also of the ancillary but very important safety measures which have to be taken to prevent people from electrocuting themselves. And finally, I will conclude with a description of the design approach which we are adopting to the various categories of listed structure along the line. So first of all then, the Great Western Railway. The Act to build the railway was passed in 1835, construction begins in the same year, and the first train ran from Bristol to London Paddington in 1841. When the Great Western was built, we think it probably had 12 trains a day, 6 in either direction. Each of those trains probably weighed 80 to 100 tonnes, and each with perhaps 40 to 80 people in each train, and they were travelling at 30 to 40 miles an hour. It is a quite extraordinary example of what today is known as future-proofing, that 174 years later, 12 trains weighing each 460, not 80 tonnes, each carrying up to 640 people, not 80 people, are travelling at 125 miles an hour on that line every hour. It is quite extraordinary the way that Brunel, and this is as true actually of the others, great early railway engineers, built a railway which could function with the vastly increased capacity which it has to carry today. And electrification, when it comes, will bring more frequent trains, longer, heavier and larger trains as well. And again, the Great Western can take it. But what sets the Great Western apart from other early lines was the involvement, as we see here a few years later, the involvement of the 27-year-old Isambard Kingdom Brunel in all aspects of the design of the Great Western. He selected the route of the line, he dealt with the detail of the engineering design, and he stopped at nothing really. He designed virtually all the structures along the line as well. And here from his sketchbook on the right-hand side, probably done late at night in some West Country inn, you see 5 possible designs for what he described as a Gothic bridge for the Bristol end of the line. And one of them, no doubt, as the candle was guttering, but this one here he described the best of all. And we'll see some examples of that best of all bridge for the Bristol end of the line a bit later on. Brunel's involvement gives the Great Western Railway this extraordinary strong sense of overall character, the sense that it was really all designed by one man. But in many ways, Brunel, with his Georgian intellectual background, was a very typical early railway engineer. And for Brunel, and for other early railway engineers, rail travel was not just about getting from A to B as directly and as quickly as possible. It was also about experiencing the landscape through which you were travelling. The journey was as important, or nearly as important, as the destination. Clearly, Brunel and others were constrained by the engineering of curves and gradients, but they brought to the design of these railways a very strong sense of the dramatic and the picturesque. And this is seen, once again, one of J.C. Bourne's engravings, but seen very clearly in this engraving of the sweeping curve by which Brunel's railway approached the city of Bath, which you can see in the background there and on the right. A very strong sense of the theatrical in the approach to the city. And Dan Cruikshank has written very eloquently about Brunel seeing his line as a kind of a carriage drive from which the landscape was appreciated and where structures, particularly bridges over the railway, so-called overbridges and tunnel portals, would offer picturesque, even sublime interest to travellers and express the landscape character through which they were travelling. In hindsight, very fascinatingly, Brunel was only partly right about how people would experience railway travel. Although to some extent this is really hardly surprising, since it's believed that Brunel himself had only travelled on a train once or twice in his life before he laid out the Great Western Railway. So no one really knew how this thing was going to work and how you would experience it as you travelled along it. Brunel was certainly right in the wider appreciation of the landscape. Going along the Great Western today, that wonderful stretch up the Thames Valley north of Reading, where the line crisscrosses over the river, is superb. So is the distant view of the White Horse of Uffington as you come towards Swindon. And so too, of course, is the approach to Bath. But Brunel was wrong, actually, in the design effort which he put into his tunnel portals and bridges. He seems to have thought that most people would travel looking forwards and backwards. So a bridge over the railway, you would see that wonderful elevation before you whooshed underneath it. In practice, the very rapid increase in the speed of locomotives and the development in carriages meant that actually people were looking sideways rather than forwards. So a lot of that effort certainly turned out to be in vain, or at least it's only today seen by drivers and track workers. But when you can see those structures, Brunel's design intention is very clear. First of all, in the underbridges and the viaducts, here we see the wonderful Maidenhead viaduct over the Thames. They are elegant engineering structures with little architectural embellishment, because you can't actually really see them from the train. When you go over the bridge at Maidenhead, you see the river, you don't really see the bridge itself. So the design of Maidenhead was driven purely by the engineering constraints of the need to get a certain clearance over the river, plus Brunel's desire to keep his line as flat and as low as possible. And the same is true of many of the overbridges which we see on the route. So that's where bridges takes a road over the top of the railway, especially on the eastern section, which are essentially really canal bridges, just made to a larger scale. Plain arched bridges designed to standard dimensions, a 30-foot width, a 16-foot height up to the crown, and making use of whatever material was locally available. But as the line travelled west, Brunel was increasingly interested in designing architecture as well as engineering. And he put most of his effort into the section from Box Tunnel, where the railway emerges from underneath the Cotswolds, down through Bath and into Bristol. The latter, of course, the home of his main shareholders, the former, Bath, where the train would be seen as well as travelled in by the polite classes. So rather than just people looking out of the railway at the landscape, people would be looking at the railway from the landscape. And the sequence starts with the wonderful Roman classical portal at Box Tunnel, which we see here in Bourne's illustration, in deference to Bath's origins and Georgian politeness. And we might assume that this extraordinary height of the tunnel compared with the locomotive just coming out is the result of artistic license. Actually, as we shall see later on, that it is genuinely an extraordinarily overscaled tunnel portal. Brunel was being more than generous in the height of the tunnel portal to get that sense of kind of grandeur as you came into this section. The route then continues here at Middlehil Tunnel, not far from Box Tunnel, where the fasces of the Roman lictors decorate either side of the tunnel portal. On down then into Bath. Here is St James's Bridge, as seen by Bourne. This crosses over the river just before Bath Spa Station, which you can see on the right with its original train shed, sadly demolished in the 1890s. Again, a very elegant arched structure in Bath stone. That is how it looked just after the Great Western opened. This is how it looks today, looking actually in the other direction, so looking north towards the city. 2 points, I think, to make here, which will be of relevance later on. The first of which is that the Bath stone that Brunel used was not always of the absolutely best quality, and it has eroded quite significantly, and there's been an awful lot of later patching using mainly purple engineering bricks, as you can see on the soffit of the arch here. The other point to make is that compared with Bourne, the whole landscape of the railway is much more heavily treed now than it was when the railway was first built, and that is really principally the result of the vegetation which has grown up on all the embankments and on all the cuttings, which tends to shield the railway from its immediate surroundings in a way which wasn't really intended when Brunel was designing it. After Bath Spa Station, which as many of you will know is designed in a kind of Tudor-Beaton style, there's an abrupt change of language to Gothic, in deference first of all to Bath's medieval city walls. This is St James's Viaduct immediately beyond the Bath side of the station, which is roughly on the site of one of the city's medieval walls. So partly in deference to Bath's medieval traditions, but also to Bristol's trading origins. And in the remaining section of the line down to Temple Meads, there is first of all a series of splendid Gothic bridges, the best of all. We'll see some of those later on, but also some absolutely wonderfully romantic tunnel portals. Here we see St Anne's Tunnel. On the left-hand side, there was actually a landslip during construction, which took away the end of the kind of matriculation of that tunnel portal. Brunel thought it was so gloriously romantic that he just actually left it as it was. But some more less picturesquely inclined, more safety-conscious engineer actually rebuilt it later on in the 19th century. So what is seen is this today, but still an absolutely fantastic piece of art. And this is one of the ones which is you can only see really if you are working on the line or driving a train. All that design effort almost entirely wasted. But the high point of Brunel's artistic input, and one which his effort certainly wasn't wasted, is here in Sidney Gardens. Sidney Gardens, as a late 18th century pleasure garden, was frequented by Bath's polite society, and the gardens were therefore the place for the railway to see and be seen. And Brunel very much rose to the challenge of that by designing what has always been described as a theatre of the railway, a place where the sublime effect of his new technology could be experienced really close up. And it remains the best place anywhere in the UK to experience the excitement of just being close to a big locomotive and its trains. And it's something which I think you don't have to be a train spotter to appreciate the extraordinary sense of immediacy with the railway that you get in Sidney Gardens. This shows the line in construction, and there are all sorts, a whole series of engravings, historic engravings and photographs of Sidney Gardens, and they always show someone, somewhere, watching the railway in action. It is the absolutely quintessential place to come and see, as I say, railways in action. So the GWR is clearly a very, very important railway. That is absolutely self-evident. But if we're to assess the acceptability of proposals for the electrification, which, as I've said, will require modification at least of some 70 listed structures along the line, we need to have a clearer understanding of exactly why it is significant. Wherein does lie its special interest as, to use contemporary jargon, a heritage asset which stretches some 118 miles from Paddington to Bristol? And the guidance produced by English Heritage is very helpful here as a starting point. As a pre-1841 railway, it belongs to the so-called pioneering phase of British and therefore worldwide railway construction. And, as the work of one of the UK's foremost engineers, it is therefore of the absolutely highest significance. Equally, and going back to my earlier definition, it is also of the highest significance as a piece of pioneering railway infrastructure which is still working as intended, indeed is working far beyond its intended capacity. And finally, it's of the highest significance for the way in which it was consciously designed to relate in engineering and in its structures to the landscape through which it passes. On the most basic level, therefore, it seems to me that the best way to preserve the significance of the Great Western Railway is simply to keep it running as a modern electrified railway which still relates to its landscape in the way that Brunel intended. But we need to descend from the general to the particular. How then is this overall significance of the Great Western Railway reflected in the individually listed structures which will be affected by the works? And here, for example, is one. This is Gatehampton Viaduct, the first of the two viaducts out of Reading as the line snakes up the Thames Valley in one of its most picturesque sections. Applying the overall significance of the line to the individually listed structures is not entirely easy, as the listed structures, both as a group and individually, do not in themselves always fully encapsulate the overall engineering significance of the Great Western Railway, which in a very real sense has more to do with alignments, cuttings and embankments than the often relatively modest and technically standard structures which cross it. But we're stuck with what we've got, the listed structures, so we've developed really three principal criteria to assess the contribution that the individual structures make to the overall significance of the line, and to use that then to measure the impact of the proposed electrification works. The first of those criteria is how do they reflect or contribute to the special engineering interest of the line. And Gatehampton Viaduct is very much like Maidenhead in that category. The proportions of this structure relate entirely to the engineering requirements of the line, so the need to create a certain headroom beneath the bridge, plus the overall engineering of the level of the line, and Brunel's desire to avoid having to move materials for cuttings and so forth around as much as possible. The second criterion, and here is one of these, this is one of the best of the five Gothic structures for the Bristol end of the line. So the second criterion is how do they relate to the landscape setting of the line when they're viewed from the train, as Brunel, as we said, clearly intended a bridge like this to be viewed. And the third criterion is how do these structures allow an appreciation of the railway as part of the wider landscape. And here, for example, at the absolutely splendid Warncliffe Viaduct, which, with its Egyptian piers and coats of arms to Lord Warncliffe, emphatically, triumphantly proclaimed the presence of the Great Western Railway here in West London. It's important to note, and we'll come back to this later on, that these criteria relate much more to the spirit of what Brunel was trying to achieve in his railway than the actual fabric of which the structures are made of. And this emphasis on significance of spirit over survival of original fabric has been very important to us when it has come to designing the new works to allow electrification to take place. Incidentally, the Warncliffe Viaduct, you can see, has already been electrified as part of the Heathrow Express programme. So now an abrupt switch to a bit of electrical physics, which I'm almost entirely unqualified to give, as I didn't even manage to get an O-level in physics. Nevertheless, it is important for us to understand what exactly electrification involves. It is very complicated, particularly if you're not a specialist, but it is very important to understand it, to establish what are the fixed parameters, what have you actually absolutely got to have for electrification, and where equally can there be flexibility in design, where you can really make an effort to make a difference. And there are two main elements to what electrification means. The first of all is what one might describe as the kit required to get the power to the train, and that's the subject of this slide here, which I should say comes from the Swiss Filmer-Sankey designers manufacturer's website, and is quite a glossy image, as you'd expect. The second aspect which we have to consider about overhead electrification is the safety, how to prevent people basically killing themselves. So first of all, the kit. It has to be, as it's spelled out here, overhead line electrification, or OLE. The third rail, such as you find on London Underground or on the southern region, is both less efficient and actually a great deal more dangerous. So, once you've chosen overhead line electrification, you have certain key components. The first of which is a wire along which runs the 25,000 volts which are required to power the train. And they're delivered through this horizontal tension wire which transmits the electricity to the train via a sort of diamond-shaped pantograph which you get on top of electric trains. The 25,000 volt wire then has to be supported on a series of masts, typically about 7 metres tall, made of galvanised steel and spaced approximately every 60 metres. There is some flexibility there, but you can't go a great deal more than 60 metres apart. There are various different standard designs of masts which have been exhaustively tested for their reliability and so forth, and we see a couple of them here. First of all, on the left, the so-called twin-track cantilever, where a mast carries the electrification for 2 lines, or the rather elegant, perhaps the wrong word to put it, but the less heavyweight single-track cantilever, where the mast simply carries the wire for a single line. Variations of that are so-called portal frames, which effectively bridge all the way across, which are needed in certain areas, but also in exceptionally sensitive areas, such as on the viaducts or on Sydney Gardens in Bath, to which we'll come to. It is possible to have bespoke masts, usually using a circular section of both a beam and of boom, in order to reduce the visual scale, the visual impact of these otherwise really quite chunky structures. But for obvious reasons, Network Rail prefers to stick to their standard, tried and tested products. Another very important fact to be aware of in electrification, this again is quite a difficult concept to get over, so please bear with me, is that there isn't a single piece of wire with 25,000 volts stretching all 118 miles from Paddington to Bristol Temple Meads. The wires are actually broken up into 1.5 kilometre sections. And as I said before, the wires are tensioned. So every 1.5 kilometres where you get a new set of wire, you have to have a rather stronger post which is able to take the tension and hold it all up like that. So the masts which we saw in the previous slide are effectively these rather leisurely people who simply have to hold it up. They're not being pulled in either direction. But then in the middle, equally, there's someone who's being pulled in both directions. And for, I guess, fairly obvious reasons, those masts need to be of a much stronger, tougher construction. And we see both a photograph of one of these so-called overlap portals here. Because there needs to be an overlap between these sections of wire, these heavy portals come in pairs. And there's a drawing of what it looks like. As you see, it is a pretty substantial piece of steelwork, and there's really relatively little that you can do to reduce that impact. The next aspect then is safety, and particularly public safety, but also safety for people working on the track. It is extraordinarily important, and we clearly need to guard against accidental electrocution, because 25,000 volts is, in 99% of cases, going to be fatal. And so it needs to be, we need to take measures to make sure that people can't accidentally come in contact with the wires, or indeed as a joke. You can't make it impossible, but you have to make it as reasonably difficult as possible. And what you need to do to achieve the required levels of safety is defined by a whole series of European and UK standards, which are very confusing to read and understand, which are designed largely with brand new bridges in mind, and are relatively inflexible, but to various degrees legally blinding. And the very important thing here is to understand where there is an element of flexibility in what you can do in designing for safety, which is something which we'll come on to later on. So then on to the approach to the individual categories of listed structures. I mean, the effects of electrification, therefore, as we've seen, are both visual, you'll see it, and they are physical. They need to be attached to all these listed structures. They're also inevitable and substantial. There is no way that you can hide overhead line electrification. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the electrification will cause harm or detract from the significance of the Great Western Railway overall, or the individual listed structures. The important thing is to think about the design as you're doing it, and to use those areas of design flexibility to reduce as much as possible the unnecessary impacts. And this applies at all levels and all scales. So let's start at the widest scale in the landscape. So, for example, with the overlap portals, if you've got a cutting or a heavily wooded bit, try and put your overlap portals there, so that by the time you come out into the open air, you don't need any of those heavy portals. You can just get away with the smaller, lighter, single or trim track cantilevers. And take particular care on viaducts or those areas where the OLE is actually silhouetted against the sky rather than being seen against the backdrop of more landscape. And finally, going back to what I said before about the increase in tree cover, which in very many cases has denied the rail traveller now the views which he was intended or she was intended to have at the time, perhaps think about carrying out some selective thinning of trees in order to reopen vistas for rail travellers as they go through the landscape. So that's it on a kind of a theoretical level. Here's a more practical example. This is one of the key views of Bath, which features the railway. So in the background we've got the core of the medieval and the Georgian city, part of the World Heritage Site, and in the foreground here we have those Dolmeads Viaduct, where the railway is really pretty prominent, running through into the city. So that's how it looks at the moment. There is fortunately a cutting and some quite heavy wooded bits over to the right here, so the overlap portals are hidden over here, which means that when you get to this open section of the route, you can actually get away with something which to many extent will be really hardly noticed. So this is just a sketch based on that last photograph, showing the OLE portals, and in case they're not immediately visible, they're coloured in red on this slide at the bottom here. So basically 4 fairly lightweight portals, which against the background, the busy background of the city of Bath, really once they're up, you will hardly see them at all. Viaducts, as I said, particularly important because you tend to get them silhouetted against the sky. And it's important there, in a sense, it's all completely self-obvious things to say. You need to work very carefully with the rhythm of the viaducts, see if you can jiggle with the spacing of the OLE to try and keep as much as possible off the actual bridge. So this is a photo montage of Maidenhead Bridge, which is being upgraded as part of Crossrail, and by carefully kind of stretching the distances between the masts as much as possible, it's been possible to get away with just one of these portals on the central pier of the bridge, the other one's actually here and off here, being mounted away off the actual structure of Maidenhead Bridge at all. This, by the way, is an example of one of these so-called bespoke portals using a circular section rather than the square sections or I-beams, which the standard OLE tends to be made of. Then there are tunnels. Well, this is what we're hoping to avoid, the kind of building up of kit in front of a very fine tunnel portal, in that case a Grade 2 star on the West Coast Main Line. What you need to try and do is, well, so again really, is to get all this stuff out of the way. And we're very fortunate, this is when it comes back to Brunel's ridiculously overscaled tunnel portals, that actually there's a lot of space in there, so all that kit which was blocking up the face of the Kilsby tunnel can actually be put within the tunnel portal, which means that you can then stretch the OLE, the first OLE mast, as far as possible away from the tunnel portal, so it'll be there, and even off the side. So again, the impact of electrification on this wonderful tunnel portal, which is incidentally one of the ones which you can see from a public place, will be really hardly visible at all once it's gone in. Then there are stations. I won't actually go into detail on stations because to some extent they're a study in their own right, but they are actually less problematic than you might think. And as an illustration, this is Paddington Station, which is actually almost completely electrified already, and you really have to go there and look very, very hard indeed before you can pick out the wires against the general background of the shed. It's quite extraordinary. It took me a long time to realise that. I thought Paddington was just electrified for the Heathrow Express, which you see here, but actually the whole of the train shed, with the exception of platform 1, is wired for electricity, and really you wouldn't notice it at all. On then to what has been the most significant challenge of the electrification project so far, which is the so-called overbridges, where you get bridges with roads or whatever going over the top of the railway. And as you can see here, Brunel designed an extraordinarily wide selection. That's one of our Bath ones. Probably this type here, the 3-span semi-elliptical arch, is the most common type. And they present problems for 2 reasons. The first problem is that you have to get the wires underneath them, and for electrification you require a clearance broadly of about 5.1 metres, which is actually a million miles away from the 16 foot, which was the standard from the track bed to the crown, which Brunel and the other engineers were working with. But as I hope this drawing shows very clearly, the problem is not so much the height at the crown of the arch, it's what happens at the shoulder of the arch there, a reflection of the fact that both the current locomotives are much kind of squarer and taller than the original locomotives on the line, but also actually interestingly the fact that Brunel was not very good at drainage. And what's happened over the years is that in order to overcome those problems of drainage, there's been a huge build-up of ballast along the line of the Great Western. In Sydney Gardens, for example, it's thought that the tracks today are as much as 70 centimetres higher than the level than they were in Brunel's time. Fortunately, it is normally either there is sufficient clearance on these bridges, or you can, by various devices, actually taking off some of this ballast and lowering the track. In most cases, it is possible to get enough headroom to get the wires underneath. But there are a few bridges which still are on the kind of execution row, I guess, because it's very, very challenging to get the wires underneath. This is one Steventon Bridge, just west of Didcot in Oxfordshire, where it's fair to say that a huge amount of investigation and discussion is going on at the moment to see whether it would be possible to avoid having to demolish Steventon Bridge. But that is, of all the ones on the route, I think the trickiest of all. So the vast majority of bridges can take the wires, and here's this one of these three-span bridges which we saw before Bourton, just before you get to Swindon. The majority of bridges can take the wires, in which case the concern becomes the safety and how you can achieve that in a way which is sympathetic to the significance of the bridge. But in order to work that out, in a way you have first of all to understand what is it about these bridges that is significant in kind of heritage terms. The first point is that it is the external elevations, it's the trackside views of these bridges which in heritage terms are really important. That's what Brunel was interested in, and that's what he was principally designing, as we saw those sketches of the bridges at the Bristol end before. He wasn't worried about what it looked like within the parapets, it was that view as you approach the bridge. So within that, the proportions of these bridges are driven by the required engineering clearances, the 30-foot width to get the tracks underneath, and as I said, the 16-foot from the track bed to the crown of the arch. And all the other proportions of this bridge follow really from those two basic measurements. But that does often produce, as here, an extraordinarily elegant form of the bridge, this curve emphasised by the fact that they all have quite a strong coper, and they also have a strong string core. So you get those two parallel lines which follow the curve. And we do actually have some props with us, which you're very welcome to look at later on, to give you some idea about what they're like at the moment and what they will look like once the work has been done. The other thing which is important about them is that they come to a very clear end, often these days obscured by a vast growth of ivy, as is the case here. And finally, important about them is the consistency of materials, the fact that they're all made of the same material, except that they've been later repaired, that material being brick or stone, depending entirely on what was locally available. So it's the consistency of material which is significant, rather in a sense than the actual materials themselves. So what are the safety requirements which have to be met as set out in those standards? And I apologise that this next bit is going to be pretty opaque and difficult to follow, but my colleague Fraser is the expert on these things, and he will be available afterwards to go through it in more detail for anyone who is interested. So the top left-hand slide here is just what we think about the significance of the bridge, which we just went through previously. The bottom one here is what you have to do to abide by the standard at its most basic. And the first thing that you have to do is that the parapets at the moment are probably 1.2 metres tall, broadly. In the central section of the bridge, that is to say 3 metres on either side of the central line, the parapet has to be at a total height of 1.85 metres, which is roughly my height here. You don't have to do that all the way across the bridge, but you do have to do it in the central section, and I think I'm right in saying, this is why I slightly hesitate, that the current coping stones are all flat. You can sit on them, you can stand on them, you can walk on them. Across the entire length of the bridge, you have to put on a new coping, which is basically a triangular shape, to stop you walking on it or sitting on it or anything like that. So increased height up to 1.85 metres in the middle, plus an anticline coper, as it's called, on either side, And then you also have to put something on the ledge to stop people kind of shuffling along on the outside of the bridge, all intended to stop people getting within dangerous distance of the wires as they run underneath. So, the Network Rail preferred standard for one of these, if it was a new bridge, would be a 1.85 metre completely solid parapet, absolutely sheer on the inside. But it was agreed very early on, that would be inappropriate for the listed bridges, so a compromise of sorts was reached, so that rather than being a solid 1.85, you have to have 1.55, so roughly up to here, as solid, and above that you can have some form of open sort of perforated sheet or mesh. And that's, again, we have the example which we're proposing to use here. This is an example of what it will look like. You will not be surprised to know that there are very complicated standards governing the size and shape of these holes, which these abide by. They're not too big, so you can put your fingers in them and help yourself climb up the walls. But this slide here just shows actually that it is surprisingly transparent when put in situ. This is a phrase of ducking down, I should say, behind the parapet to show the effect of having one of those pieces of perforated sheet. The question then is, how do we meet those requirements in the best possible way? Well, in the first place, by the very careful design of the profile of this anti-walk coper, to do our best to preserve that kind of the topmost of those parallel lines. So this is the existing coper here. So there's the parallel line, the line made by the coping stone. There's the line made by the string course. You've got to have this angled thing to stop people sitting on it. But by having this little vertical face here, we can do as much as possible to retain that sense of a strong line across the top of the bridge. The second thing we can do is to achieve the required height by using matching materials, whether it's brick or bath stone, to raise the thing up to its existing height. So not use a new material, you use something which was what is already there in the existing bridge, whether that's bath stone, pendant stone, blue lias or brick, depending on what section of the route you're on. The second way is to think very carefully about how to achieve the necessary height. There are two ways, well in fact there are a myriad of ways of doing this, but we've taken the two kind of extremes. So you could just abide by the strict letter of the standards and simply raise the bridge to its required height with its mesh in the central section. And the benefit of that is that it retains the maximum amount of the original Brunel fabric which would survive at either end of the bridge. The alternative is to go the whole hog and actually replace everything in matching materials up to 1.55 across the total width of the bridge, but to keep the mesh, the perforated sheet, just in the central section as part of the kind of OLE kit rather than as part of the bridge. And our view is that the second of those, so this one here, is actually, in this case, by far the best way of dealing with these bridges. Yes, it loses a great deal more of the original fabric, but to our mind, it preserves the significance of the bridge for its role in the landscape, which is what Brunel was really interested in when he was designing this bridge. And if we take just a kind of a fairly rough before and after shot, this is our old friend Clay Bridge. Again, this is as it looks at the moment. And if we do what we suggest and raise it all the way across and put the perforated sheet in the middle, that, once the stone is worn after a few years, that is what would look like. And that, for us, is the essence of what Brunel was trying to achieve on this line. And it's more important to do that than to try and keep the outer sections of the original bridge. And then to Sydney Gardens, the most difficult challenge of them all by a very long way. We've been having the same debate over this kind of fabric versus spirit in Sydney Gardens, which is incidentally identified as a component of the outstanding universal value of the Bath World Heritage Site. But there, as we've said before, for Brunel, it was that sense of proximity to the working railway that was absolutely paramount, and it's that which we need to seek to try and maintain in Sydney Gardens. And it represents a major challenge. Here's another of those contemporary drawings. Here are the next generation of train spotters or railway enthusiasts looking at the line. And here they are today. It's extraordinary that every picture has the same people in the same place, all watching and admiring the railway. But bringing electrification through Sydney Gardens does represent a very significant challenge indeed. In the first place, you have to bring your 25,000 volt wires through here. This wall along here, the so-called low balustrade wall, is far lower than it should be. It's just over a metre tall, and as you can see, it offers an ideal sitting point for people when literally you are, probably if I'm standing here, the train is kind of here somewhere, you know, you really are close to the railway there. And it's this sort of thing which gives Network Rail safety managers, you know, sleepless nights. So you've got to do something about that. Oh, sorry. And finally, you've got to do something about the two bridges which go over the top. This one here in the front, the only surviving one of Brunel's cast iron bridges, and you know, just to emphasise it, cast iron bridge, 25,000 volts running underneath it. That kind of sums up the challenge. They both have open parapets and were clearly designed to give that maximum sense of proximity to the railway. But it's worth saying here that Network Rail has very much taken up the challenge of dealing with Sydney Gardens and has indeed publicly committed itself to a 21st century electrification set piece worthy of Brunel's Theatre of the Railway. When I fixed the date for this lecture, I thought we'd be rather further forward than we are today. It's taking an inordinately long time, and so we are still working on the solutions. But we can start to give you an idea of how it might look. And so, for example, this is the OLE, the masts for the wires curved and mounted on the retaining wall to reflect the curving nature of that retaining wall. The low balustrade wall here needs to have one of these sort of anti-climb copers, but that can be done in Bath stone, and the ground behind it lowered in order to get you the required 1.5 metres there. And so you'll still be pretty close to the trains as they go past. And you can certainly step up the bank here to get that slightly higher view. Then there are the two bridges. Here we are looking to be flexible in the application of those various standards on safety, although that does require a very thorough risk assessment, which is really the reason why this process is going relatively slowly at the moment, and indeed final approval by the Office of Rail Regulation to make the case for moving away from the standards, and equally, and very importantly for that person, to protect the designer against any potential charges of manslaughter in the unfortunate event of an accident. So on these two bridges, we would love to be able to keep the existing parapet heights. Though the stone bridge here will need to have an anti-climb coper stuck on the top because it's got a very wide parapet on the top of it. We'd love also to keep their open nature, not to have to fill in the bits, the balustrades here, and that could be done in line with the European standards, but that would require a derogation from the normal Network Rail standards, which interestingly are rather stricter than the European standards on this matter. We would also need on these two bridges, and we are looking at some form of what's described as a hood, which would be fixed onto the outer face of the bridge to come out here to give you the required 2.25 metres, I think, which needs to be between the person and the electric wire. It's something which we're working on very carefully at the moment, and the idea is that those hoods here and here would be designed rather like the mesh to be part of the kit of electrification rather than part of the structure of the bridge. It would be very clearly an add-on. But if we are able to achieve that, it would mean that you still do get a good sense of that very extraordinary relationship between the railway and the people in Sydney Gardens. So, as a conclusion then, the project remains and has always been exceptionally challenging, and we still have to ensure that the quality of materials and workmanship lives up to expectations. All this great work can be ruined if it's not really, really well done. And quite soon you'll be able to judge for yourselves how well we've succeeded, or indeed failed. We haven't succeeded everywhere, and there is a clear scope for improvement. The project has been very much a pioneer, and lessons have been and are being learned and applied to the Midland. And this is, as it were, the Sydney Gardens of the Midland, the extraordinary sequences of bridges just to the north of Belper Station, which is one of those lines which is due for electrification in the next stage. I hope that there's much that we can feel proud about. It's been a challenging project because in the first place it's been a learning curve for all of us involved, Network Rail engineers, ourselves as ambassadors, Historic England and the conservation officers along the route. Previous assumptions have been challenged and new, less destructive ways have been discovered for achieving electrification, and that's particularly in the case of getting the wires underneath those bridges. But it's also challenging because the sheer scale has highlighted the need for a new approach to dealing with our historic infrastructure. As I said at the start, the fact that 174 years later the GWR still works as infrastructure is a crucial part of its overall significance. To keep it working, we must be prepared to accept a significant level of change. But within those inevitable constraints, we believe that you can design the changes to work with, to harmonise with the existing railway, and crucially, to retain its relationship to the landscape, to the passengers, and to the viewers. This may mean paying more attention to the spirit of the design and less to the preservation of the original built fabric. In short, and if treated with care, electrification is far from a disaster for our historic infrastructure and can actually enhance its significance. By quite literally building on the existing legacy of Brunel and his fellow engineers, we can keep it relevant, experienced and enjoyed by millions of rail travellers in the way that Brunel wanted. Thank you very much indeed.